Okay, so let's talk a little more about blood. In the last clip, we talked about the function of blood. We talked a little bit about the components of blood in terms of the fact that there's a liquid matrix in the form of plasma, and then it's connective tissue, so it's cells in a matrix, right? So the matrix is that liquid plasma, and then the cells are going to be really the three types of blood cells. There's red blood cells, which we're going to call erythrocytes. Not we, everybody. There are the white blood cells, which are leukocytes, and then there are the platelets, which are the thrombocytes. And then in the plasma, there's a bunch of proteins and some other components we're going to talk about later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these things here, which we're going to call red blood. Actually, everybody's going to call them red blood cells, erythrocytes. Now, erythrocytes have one job. That's it, one single job. But that single job is one of the more important jobs in the body, and that is transporting gases, and specifically oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, what do we need these gases for? What do we need oxygen for? Well, you remember from your biology class, in order to produce ATP, you have to go through a process called cell respiration, and oxygen is one of the important ingredients you need for that process to occur. It keeps that whole thing going, and it lets your mitochondria churn out a whole bunch of ATP. Now, let's talk a little bit about the structure of the red blood cells and why structurally they are really built to do what they're supposed to do. You can think of red blood cells as little cars, and they're little cars that zoom around your blood vessels, and they are carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. And their shape helps them do that. They have what is called a biconcave shape. What does that mean? Well, if you looked at a red blood cell from the side, it would look something like this, where you have a concave surface on both sides, here and here. So if you look over here, you can see this is an image of a red blood cell and what they look like. Now, why do they have a biconcave shape? Well, there's really three main advantages to having that biconcave shape. Now, you remember from class me mentioning this many times, shape a lot of times is going to have something to do with surface area. Now, if you take a look here, this area right here that I'm coloring blue, that would not exist if this was just a solid, if it just looked like this, we just lost all that extra surface area. And why would surface area be a benefit in this scenario? Well, surface area means more opportunity for oxygen to get into the cell and out of the cell. So just think of a room with more doors. If it has more doors, it's going to allow more people to come in and out. So that increased surface area allows for more oxygen transfer. Another difference is if you look here, you can see that in this scenario, in order to get to the middle of the cell, there's a little bit of a distance that has to be traveled. Where on this scenario here, by having this concave shape, it just makes it so there's less distance to travel to get to where the hemoglobin is, which, as we're going to talk about in a moment, that's the actual molecule that holds onto the oxygen. So it just makes it easier for things to get in and out. And finally, our blood vessels are not traveling in straight lines. They are dipping in and out of bones, and they are going around and through different parts of the body and twisting, and there's small blood vessels. And think of a water slide. Think of the most complex water slide you've ever seen. Now imagine trying to get around all those bends and being in a square tube. That wouldn't work very well. So if you look at an inner tube, it looks a lot like a red blood cell, and that's to allow these blood vessels to sneak around each other and to get around these tight bends of the blood vessels. Now, how do they actually carry the oxygen? Well, they use a molecule called hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin, heme means blood, and globin refers to a protein. Hemoglobin is a complex protein structure. It's actually made up of 4 different proteins, these chains of proteins. So if you look over at this diagram here, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. And their job is they just carry oxygen. So in the middle of each one of these, and we'll talk more about the structure of hemoglobin on the next slide, but in the middle of each of these hemoglobins is an iron. And if you know anything about iron, iron likes oxygen. If you have if you have a car, you have paint on your car. And the reason for that paint is not just to make the car look nice, it's also to protect the metal underneath. And if that paint peels up, you've all seen it before, you get rust. And what rust is the oxidation of iron. If you have any iron and it gets oxidized, it's going to rust. And that is what gives blood its reddish color, actually. If you look at rust, it's red in color. And the iron in your blood, once it gets oxygenated, it becomes red. Now, red blood cells do something very bizarre when you're talking about a cell. If you remember back to learning about chondrocytes, I told you that they do something that's very, very odd for a cell. They purposely kill themselves by building that thick wall around themselves, and then they die off. Well, red blood cells do something similar in terms of sacrificing themselves for the greater good. And that is that red blood cells, as they mature, when they first form in the bone marrow, because remember, all your blood cells form in your bone marrow, when they first form in the bone marrow, they have a nucleus, obviously, because they are a cell. But then they do something very odd. They eject their nucleus. They just kick it right out. And they end up with no nucleus in there, but that gives them more room for hemoglobin. So what that does, if you look at this little stat here, 1/3 of the red blood cell is actually going to be hemoglobin. So it's a good portion of it is going to be that hemoglobin. It would be like, imagine if you were a driver for like a delivery service, right? And you have a bunch of seats in your car, but you never carry people. You just carry stuff like boxes. One of the things you might do to be able to carry more boxes is you can take those seats out of the car. You remove those seats, and now you just got a big open space that allows you to carry more boxes. Well, think of a red blood cell as doing that. It kicks out its nucleus, and then it ends up having more space for oxygen. And that's pretty impressive in terms of structurally, and it's a big decision to make on a life scale, because now that red blood cell can't replicate. So red blood cells, they live for maybe, if you're lucky, a few days, maybe a week or two. They can live up to 2 or 3 weeks, but then they're gone, and they never, that's why you keep making more. You're constantly making more and more red blood cells because they do not replicate themselves. The normal red blood cell count is about 4 to 6 million red blood cells for a millimeter cubed of blood. So that's a small amount of blood, a millimeter by a millimeter by a millimeter, a little tiny cube. That's 4 to 6 million red blood cells. Now, that number doesn't mean anything to you right now, but as we go through the other types of blood cells, you'll see that the red blood cells are a lot. There's a lot of them compared to the other types of blood cells. We have way more red blood cells than any other type of blood cell. And you can see we have a slight increase. So like, you're going to make more red blood cells in times when you need them. So for example, if you're exercising, that's why a trained athlete is going to be, I've talked about that a lot in class. If you're training, your body's going to be able to handle more oxygen and produce more energy. So you're going to be in better shape. Also, you're going to have a decrease if you bleed, if you have a condition like an anemia or leukemia. Okay, a little more about hemoglobin. Sorry. What is it made of? Well, it's made up of these 4 proteins, these globins, these 4 polypeptide chains, and then in the middle of those polypeptide chains, we have that heme group, and that heme group is really just an iron molecule, and that can hold on to oxygen. Now, if you take a look here, this is a hemoglobin molecule with 4 proteins. And then you might remember from the muscle unit, we talked about myoglobin. Myoglobin and hemoglobin work the same way. The difference is myoglobin only has 1 protein and 1 heme group, so it can hold on to 1 oxygen, where hemoglobin can hold 4. So hemoglobin is definitely the better option in terms of what it can do, but myoglobin is smaller and more stable, so it is able to, pack into those muscle cells. So it's just having that extra oxygen on hand, where hemoglobin, its job is to go through the blood vessels, carrying its oxygen. Hemoglobin is really good at connecting to oxygen, and that's called affinity. So the attraction to oxygen is called affinity for oxygen. Now, one thing about hemoglobin, which you may not have known, is that it actually has a stronger affinity for carbon monoxide, or CO. And that's a problem, because that's why carbon monoxide poisoning is so dangerous. It actually likes carbon monoxide better than oxygen. So when you breathe in carbon monoxide, your red blood cells start carrying that instead of the oxygen, and you suffocate. And that's why it's so dangerous. Your body doesn't know it's happening. You fall asleep, you just don't wake up with carbon monoxide, because your body thinks things are going fine. It would be like if your car was built to hold a certain type of person and somebody else got in and they fit just fine. You're going to just keep going about your business, and that's what happens with carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, we're going to finish up here with hemoglobin. A couple more things about it. How do we regulate it? Well, basically, it's on whether or not oxygen is present. So oxyhemoglobin is going to be when you have oxygen present, and that is going to be a bright red blood. And then we call it deoxyhemoglobin when oxygen is released, and it turns into a dark reddish. I have bluish here, and it's really more like a maroonish reddish color, a deeper red. It never really turns blue. Oxyhemoglobin is oxygen's present, that's a bright red, and then deoxyhemoglobin is going to be when oxygen is released, and it turns a deep dark red. Cyanosis is a term you should be familiar with. Cyanosis is oxygen deficiency. It's also called hypoxia, and you can tell when somebody's going through that because their lips will actually turn blue, among other things. And that is one of the, we're at home right now because of this virus that we're all dealing with. And one of the things that they think is happening with this virus, and there's still a lot of research being done, but they think that the virus is actually kicking the iron out of the hemoglobin molecules. And by kicking the iron out of the hemoglobin molecules, your hemoglobin can no longer carry oxygen. So it's not just a lung issue. This virus, they still don't really understand it. But what we do know is the virus does a lot more than just affect your lungs. And one of the things they're pretty confident with is that it knocks the oxygen or the iron off of the hemoglobin. And now your hemoglobin is, for one thing, you have iron issues in your blood now. You have too much iron in your blood, which is a problem. And also, your red blood cells can't carry oxygen, so they go through a cyanotic process. So people are getting hypoxia with this condition, and it's because the red blood cells are not able to carry their oxygen. I want to finish up here by talking about something called erythropoiesis, and that is the formation of red blood cells, and that happens in your bone marrow. So we have a hormone called erythropoietin, and erythropoietin, poietin, it depends, you can see it either way, is a hormone that triggers the erythrocyte formation. So, for example, if you go on a trip, let's say, to Colorado, and you've never been there before, and you're up in Denver, Colorado at a higher altitude, you're going to get something called altitude sickness. And for the first day or two, you're going to probably not feel great because there's less oxygen up there because you're at a higher altitude, the air is less dense, there's less available oxygen. And that's why you start to feel a little sick. You get dizzy, you might get nauseous, you get tired, and then your body kicks into gear and you start making more red blood cells, and now you're able to handle that, you're able to hold more oxygen than normal, and you're able to handle it. So if you take a look over here, you can see this is the basic process of how erythropoiesis works. Your kidneys actually have the ability to tell whether or not there's enough oxygen in your blood. So your kidneys, as your blood goes through your kidneys, it registers whether or not you are anemic or you have hypoxia. And if that is the case, it kicks up erythropoietin, which is that hormone, and that triggers your red blood cells to start making, your red marrow starts to make more red blood cells and puts them into the bloodstream. And eventually your kidney will register that that is at normal levels, and then it will stop making that hormone, and your red blood cell count will go hopefully back to normal. Okay. That's it. Thank you.